Okay, we're live back with another Kink Tank episode. And for this one, we're going to be talking about BDSM reading. So these are books of fiction and nonfiction that our esteemed panel here, even though it's a small esteemed panel, it's the elite panel, we'll call it.
We have a lot of esteem, not a lot of panel.
Or maybe a lot of panel, not a... talk about some of the things that we've read along the way in our experiences in kink, and some of the things that we can recommend, and some of the things that were even utterly awful. If you guys have any of those recommendations of things to stay away from, that would be fine too. But let's talk a little bit about nonfiction reading. So what are some of the books that you've read that you thought were particularly good? Let's say when you were starting, as a beginner book, something that's sort of, all together, sort of general, a good introduction to BDSM.
You mean like handbooks and things like that?
Sure. I'm thinking of SM 101, for instance.
Which we have right there, SM 101.
I still recommend that book. I read that one. It gave me, I think, a pretty good idea. I mean, it was written a long time ago, and I think some of the things are, maybe need a little bit of updating, or the way that I see BDSM sort of practiced and manifested in our relationships might have changed a little bit since then. But I think it's a pretty good,
And along that line, I know Screw the Roses, Send Me the Thorns was another one that was quite popular.
That's a very popular one. Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine actually read When Someone You Love Is Kinky, which is almost like the Al-Anon of kinky books, right? It didn't teach you how to be kinky. It taught you how to be around kinky people.
I'd never even heard of that one, actually. When Someone You Love Is Kinky.
Yeah, let me zhuzhel that real quick to make sure.
It sounds like an affliction. I really like that.
Yeah, I know. It's like...
Oh, no, but I mean, I think the reason that well, I say a friend, actually, it was actually an ex of mine who had read it, because when you're in a vanilla relationship and you start discovering kink, it becomes much more difficult to explain that to somebody who's not at the same place you are. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of these books that has a lot of language that you're probably struggling to find to explain. Plus, it's a neutral description. It's not coming from the same kind of emotional place that you are going like, please don't hate my guts, but...
Mm-hmm.
So hold on. It is a real thing. Amazon has it in their sexual health in general. Oh, it's actually written by Dossie Easton.
Okay. Because she also wrote the Screw the Roses.
Who else? She also wrote the Good Bottoming book and the Good Topping book.
Right.
We've got the Bottoming book here. But I'm going to save another one that she wrote, because I'm saving that for later.
Okay.
Yeah, nonfiction right now.
Okay. Another one that I thought was particularly good was The Master's Manual by Jack Granella. It was a little bit strange for me, because I guess I had never been exposed to any kind of gay kink relationship dynamics, and his book is pretty much written from a gay master's perspective. Of course, the principles largely apply. It was actually a pretty short read too, so it was a lot of good information in a condensed form, which I always appreciate. I always appreciate that. I also know that he did a glossary of terms that a lot of people are sort of fans of. We've talked about terminology quite a bit on this.
The Dictionary of Scene-Friendly Terms by
Right.
Jack Granella.
Yeah, and that is even it's almost a pamphlet.
Yeah.
But
you find them in a lot of run bags for events.
Right. Because they just, buy them by the caseload. All right. Other nonfiction.
The toy bag. Toy bag guides.
Toy bag guides. Is that a series of books, or?
Yeah, it's a series. They're very small. The first one I got was on caning. Which one was that one? We've got one here, Hot Wax and Temperature Play. but it's basically like kink-specific manuals, like how to do things safely and, you know, how to extract the most entertainment out of it.
Like how to set up, you know, general safeties.
By the way, I was just looking at the new topping book and the new bottoming book, and yes, that was Dossie Easton, but also Janet Hardy.
Yeah.
And those you come highly recommended for a lot of people. Pretty concise. Of course, there are a lot of them that are. I mean, these what we've talked about thus far are mainly books that are sort of dynamic, instructive for your dynamics. You know, about DS relationships and about mastery and so forth. Not necessarily about different kinds of play that you might engage in, and there are quite a few of those nonfiction books that go into
Like these
different
two?
kinds of play as well. What are you showing us, Gypsy?
So I have the Human Pony book, which was by Rebecca Wilcox, and then also Submiss Ann did a pony play book. So these are specifics on a particular type of play and stuff, but they're both very unique and different, kind of in their approaches, as it were.
A subset of the kink community.
Sure.
And then I know there's different books for puppy play and stuff like that as well. Wolf being a big one.
Yeah, Wolf's the big one.
And stuff that a lot of the kind of puppy community has, and you know, oh, I got my start in this because I read this book, kind of thing. So those are popular.
And from an international puppy title holder, that's a pretty strong endorsement.
Well, I see a lot of people, and I will admit I've actually never read it yet, and stuff, because I just got my experience from being in the community. There's only so much that reading can do for you. There's only so much research you can do online. There's only so much, you know, of anything you can do, but a lot of times the getting out and doing it and being involved in that community and being part of that community is what gives you, at least in my opinion, a lot more perspective on how people actually apply what may be written in these books and things like that. So.
I'll second that. I mean, I know that when I was reading some of these, you know, SM 101, that was a good sort of, you know, baseline, just sort of in general to kind of get my mind in the right perspective of thinking about these things.
Yep.
But yeah, you're not going to learn everything from a book, fiction or nonfiction. Certainly not fiction. Please don't read some E.L. James shit. Just be like, honey, I know how to do BDSM now. Let's do this.
Step one, get a chopper.
That's right. Your first thing you have to do is get a Tango Charlie Tango or.
Hey, let's not. We haven't gone into nonfiction yet.
Yeah.
All right, I'm jumping the gun. My bad.
Now, so go ahead.
I was going to say, as far as dynamics go, and as far as play go, I'm a fan of Rob Rubel's, Dr. Robert Rubel, I should call him. He does a number of different books on protocol, and he has one that I read quite a while ago called Protocol's Handbook for the Female Slave. He does some other sort of dynamics books, BDSM Mastery Relationships, a guide for creating mindful relationships for dominants and submissives, apparently co-written by someone named M. Jen Fairfield. He did a one called Master-Slave Relations, Communications 401. One on that I just love the title of Squirms, Screams, and Squirts, going from great sex to extraordinary sex, which isn't necessarily a BDSM thing, but Protocol Handbook for the Leather Slave, Art of Slavery. I mean, he's got a lot of material out there, and two of the books that I liked particularly were his Impact Play books and his Fire Play books. So, Bob Rubel, look him up. Robert J. Rubel, PhD. He's got a lot of stuff out there. Now, in person, when I've been to his classes and stuff, he's a very nice man. You can see he's pretty quickly. He's a very fastidious person, and he talks about his Asperger's a lot. So if you're looking for like the nitty grit of relationship dynamics, he will give it to you in the book. Lots of nitty grit. Any other books come recommended? We can move on to fiction if you like.
The
What's
Leatherman's
that?
Handbook. I wanted to say that
Oh.
one for later because Leatherman's Handbook is interesting because it's not really a manual. It's almost like a collection of anecdotes and historical experiences mixed in with some porn.
Okay.
Nice.
Have you read it?
I've read pieces of it, not front to back, and there was a second edition of that too, wasn't there?
It was an updated version because he had some things in there like that were, what they considered old leather bar protocol. Things like, I never trusted anybody who didn't drink, right? Like you went to the bar to drink, and so if you ever met people who didn't drink, because of the time that it was written, you were like, okay, well that might be a cop, right? Whereas now, because there's been an opening in terms of the community, and you're not sort of persecuted the same way, there's a lot of people who just don't drink in the leather community, and so there are some adjustments made for lack of a better term, the shift in cultures related to generational changes.
See, I always thought it was like an appendix or a sort of a sequel to the book,
No.
rather than a reissue. Okay. So
Well,
yeah, they've got
it's an updated version, but it's not a sequel. There might be a second one.
because it says Leatherman's Handbook the original and Leatherman's Handbook 2.
Okay, there might be a second. I
And
read
then
the updated version of the original plus the original.
I see the Leatherman's Handbook Silver Jubilee edition.
Yeah, which is the updated. Yeah, is it 25 years?
Terrible title.
I like this title though from Joseph Bean. He has a book called Leather Sex.
Yeah.
I like that word.
Now, I don't know. I don't want to kill too much time, but another really important book that I personally recommend to everybody that I talk to about the kink community is The Ethical Slut.
Okay, and that is sort of across the board. That is the #1 book in poly circles that people recommend as
The
well.
problem I have is that it's definitely pigeonholed that way, but it's really about how to behave ethically in relationships to get what you want. There's large chunks of it dedicated to monogamy as well that I think are undersold. But it's really a good book for how a lot of really important things in there, like how to view your own emotions, how to handle your own emotions in the context of relationships to improve the quality of your relationships in general.
Right. It's not specifically written for kink, but it can in fact help your kink relationships a great deal. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because I think it talks a lot about ownership, about being responsible for your own behaviors in the context of a relationship.
Yeah, and that book's less, how to be poly or how to be kinky, and more how not to be an asshole.
Yeah.
Which is useful in all
Exactly.
realms. Whether
Yeah.
if you have relationships, then it's probably helpful. I like the language of that book. It kind of has a sense of humor about itself. I don't know. It feels a little bit less like I don't do so well with a lot of the nonfiction books because they feel a lot like they're handbooks, and I know they're handbooks, but the tone tends to be like you're reading a history book, or it's just not fun. And that book's kind of fun to read. Yeah, it's very technical, which kind of makes you, like, the irony of that also kind of distracts me, and I just can't stay with it. I don't know if Emily has this problem too, but
Yeah, not really. I looked through the lending library at the Mix, and I was able to stick with the books that had a lot of pictures in them, and I felt like I was 5. But the general nonfiction selection out there is hard to stick with, in my opinion.
but the tone of that one's nice.
The reason I mention that, though, is because I agree with you. The tone of the book resonated with me because I didn't feel like I was being lectured to about how to do relationships right.
Yeah.
But Dossie Easton and was it Janet Hardy, who wrote this, also wrote the new topping book, the new bottoming book, a couple of those other ones that, again, have that same sort of general tone, which is, let's not take ourselves too seriously, but here are some good practices.
Right.
So again, I thought that in terms of instructional, and again, it's the same thing with the Leatherman's Handbook. It's not like a you must do this, you must do this. It's, let me tell you my story and how things kind of were when I was involved, which was a lot.
I don't know. Some of the parts of the Leatherman's Handbook that I did read were very much instructional. That were, and that's the way, and maybe it's just the sections that I read, or these were included in I didn't get the context around in which it was included, but I'm reading things about the way a Leatherman looks. Like a Twoo Leatherman looks like this. He's groomed, facial hair is a certain way, fingernails clipped, no jewelry, no perfumes, wears leather here, here, and here, but not here. And
but hold on, though. I don't necessarily disagree with you, but again, one of the things that I took away from that was really important to me is that they as much as it reads like a how-to, to me, it reads more like a history of the way the leather community was when the book was written, which would have been the 70s. So this concept of how do you sort out who a Leatherman is in a gay bar versus just another gay guy, or versus, you know what I mean? Like there's this sense of, we like to have a particular look, but it's also how do we distinguish us versus them? It's like going to coffee in a public space and being the people who say, well, we know to look for the leather rose. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? It's less about you must do these things than that's how you can spot your ilk in a crowd.
Gotcha.
Well, and part of that is what people quote from that book. A lot of people quote it as, whether it was intended to be that way or not, a lot of people quote it as this is how one should behave or this is what should happen. And whether it's meant to be read that way or not, I don't know. But that's been my experience with it as well. A lot of people quote it as
Bible, yeah.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of people quote it as Bible as well because the guy who wrote it was famous in the leather community. I mean, he was one of the first people to come out as a published author, so he became sort of the sole
authority
reference point. And so I think what happens, and as you've seen, right, we see this all the time with people who like take up rope or whatever else. It's like the source of that information becomes sort of the guiding light of that movement. Mm-hmm. So you have one person who sort of becomes the de facto godfather, as it were, of that. I mean, when I first got involved, like when you talked about rope, it was Midori. Like you didn't know anything about rope unless you read a Midori book. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Not like 8,000 different people weren't doing rope, but Midori was publishing, so everybody knew who Midori was. You know what I mean? And so at the time, if you weren't doing it Midori's way, you were doing it wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that she was writing it saying this is the only way to do it. She was just the only person writing about it.
Right. A published authority that everybody sort of looked to as,
right.
And Larry Townsend was very much the same way, you say?
That's my opinion, yeah.
Okay.
And so I think now, even a decade later, you don't hear people talking about the Leatherman's Handbook the way you did 10 years ago, and I'm sure it was different even 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot more people writing about the leather community now. This book was written before there was the Leather Journal and all those other kinds of things that come out that now can inform people. There was before there was an internet. So,
right.
That's what you got.
Yeah, and I found that, when I got my start, and I'm thinking of the year 2000, okay, there was an internet. How much material there was out there was maybe lacking, but it's not like it is now, and so you sort of went to, like back in the old days, you wanted some porn, you went to the porn shop, you got magazines, maybe some VHS tapes or something like that, and there was whatever was offered was sort of, because either that was all that was out there or that was what they stocked because that's what people had the most interest in. So when you wanted to find out some more about these things, there was community, obviously, but I think there was a bit more of you should read this book and you should read this book, whereas today it's kind of like, as Gypsy was saying, you should get involved or you should participate. there are a lot of gems of good learning scattered throughout the internet that you can find that aren't necessarily condensed in a book.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe the age of book learning BDSM is maybe coming to a close, or
Yeah, and I think
would you
you
disagree?
make an interesting point, though, about the amount of quote-unquote nonfiction that was published on the internet back in the day was written typically by people who had access to the internet, which typically meant either academics or geeks. And so the reader
Early adopters, yeah.
Yeah, and so you really had, to Alyssa's point, very technical stuff that was dry. You know, people who were doing college papers and things like that, or like I said, sometimes you had historical researchers who were posting things. But again, people who had a reason to be on the internet versus now when you have it in your phone.
Yeah, because sometimes those gems are in someone's Facebook posts or their FetLife journal or something like that, not necessarily in a book that you can go to the bookstore and find. That brings me to another. It's a related thing, but when you go to the local bookstore, does anybody else find it really kind of appalling what their BDSM section looks like? Now, I haven't been since the 50 Shades of Grey bomb hit, okay, but I used to go into Barnes & Noble or even some of the local, Carmichael's and things like that, looking for BDSM books. And, of course, there was like a shelf like this, and there was SM 101.
I would qualify that even further. We literally were just in a bookstore 2 weeks ago. We went to Barnes & Noble on Hurstbourne, and it had one cabinet, maybe 4 feet wide by 4 feet high, which was the entirety of their sex and sexuality.
Right. Yeah,
section.
They've got a sexuality section.
Right, which includes, like you said, maybe this much on BDSM, but it's like, the Cosmo Kama Sutra and, any kind of books on coming out as gay or anything. I mean, it was... But there's literally 2 full aisles on both sides of Christian fiction.
Ugh.
Yeah, ours has a lot of picture books too. There's like a really small section on kink, and it's beautiful photography, but it's basically famous people taking pictures of people in corsets and leather and kind of odd positioning, and it's like all picture books. And I think there's like one kind of book, kind of like The Ethical Slut, but I don't remember what it was called. It's kind of a how to be in a weird relationship kind of a book.
Raise an interesting point, because Megan has been shopping for books at used bookstores now, and so you can find some gems in there sometimes. But a lot of those books were incredibly personal in that the author or the person who, for lack of a better term, curated the content, it was like their fetish. And so one book she got was one guy's quest to find people who were into rubber. So it was all these photographs of different rubber people from around the world, but that's it. That's what you had to look at. I think this book was written in the 80s, maybe. And it's interesting because I don't know that a lot of people know that like almost every men's fitness magazine historically comes from the fact that you couldn't buy gay porn. So guys who wanted to publish gay porn published them as fitness magazines. It was the only way that you could get pictures of oiled up guys in Speedos in print. And so like Muscle and Fitness and all those were originally all gay porn.
Because women didn't buy porn either, obviously.
Well, no, and it was funny, they did, because they were saying that the readership for Playgirl, because there used to be like rock stars that would brag about having been in Playgirl, and the running joke was that it was all read by gay men. Like, women didn't read Playgirl, gay men did.
Right.
So it was like, congratulations, you're a star among the gays. Like, here you are thinking you're accumulating groupies, but no.
Well, you are.
Well, I suppose, yeah.
I don't think less people read. I mean, I'm trying to think of these kind of newer books. I don't think less people want to get their information from books now. I think probably more people want to get their information from reading material, but it's not necessarily books. And I think most of the time it's a tone issue, because a book gets really stuffy, and a lot of people will edit themselves out of books like that, and they become a general guide, in the name of either, I don't know if it's because of discretion or because of just trying to keep it general enough that everybody in the public would want to read it. But you tend to lose this giant dimension of personal content in it, and I don't think people that are trying to read about kink or trying to read about BDSM at all want you to take the people out of it, because the main question they usually have is, how do you do it? Not how do people do it, how do you do it?
Or
like
how should you do it? Or
yeah, without having to go to the community first. The book comes first, and that's how they work up the courage. So I feel like a lot of the people that I know that are just really, really voracious readers, they don't go to books. They go to internet content. So they go to ebooks and they go to blog posts, because a lot of those have there are YouTube channels, a lot like this one, where people are just talking about different subjects and they find them a lot more informative.
But here's an
I think
interesting.
the nonfiction suffers.
You raise a really interesting point, because I've been fortunate enough to do classes where I teach things, right? So if we consider that sort of nonfiction, presentation of information, invariably I'll teach a class that I think went really well, and people will come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, that was a really great class. It was really informative." But invariably I get the same question over and over again, which is, "Yeah, I understand what you're doing, but how do you do it? Like, how do you start? Like, how do you introduce this into a relationship?" It's just like, I'm not.
And that's a legitimate question, though.
I don't think it's a legitimate question, but
you can explain to me all you want what a fork is. That's great, but if I don't know what to do with it, it's a useless tool.
Well, yeah, sort of like me. But the point I'm trying.
You said it, not me.
go ahead, Shane.
So the point I was trying to make is that there isn't a lot of material that I've read. There's a lot of great stuff like, so you've purchased your own cane and now you want to know how to use it. And it's like, okay, but how do I talk to my partner about wanting to hit them with something? So I'm imagining, like I said, that, when someone you love is kinky has more of that introductory, how do you kind of broach that conversation with somebody? That would be an interesting thing to see, like you said, for the people who are still out there and researching, if anybody has any recommendations about that.
Sure, but there's a place for all those things. There is a place for the book that's like, you bought your first cane and here's how to use it.
Oh, yeah.
It's not the beginner necessarily who hasn't come out to their partner, but there is a value to having a book like that, purely instructional for a very narrow thing.
And they are more like leaflets. They're about the size of that. The ones we were talking about, the toy bag books, are the same as that Jack Ranella dictionary BDSM terms. It's real thin.
Yeah, but my point is, are you going to buy that pamphlet, or are you going to go on Amazon to buy it, or are you going to go to FetLife and find someone, are you going to read about it somewhere else on a blog?
I buy it because I figure that people who are published, right or wrong, have proven to somebody that's willing to spend money to publish it that there's some credence to what they're posting, as opposed to anybody who can write on the internet.
Oh, I don't know about that. Small publishers.
No, I agree.
A good job, and that's not a.
I understand that. I agree, but what I'm saying is, a preponderance of the writing is going to be more vetted, in my opinion, than anybody who can unedited. I mean, there's a lot of great information I've passed over because it was almost unreadable in terms of the grammar and the language.
Sure.
Doesn't matter
I would say, largely my experience with published nonfiction BDSM is that it's good. It's valuable. It may not be vetted, it may not be, the best information out there. But Shane, I think you're right. It's not that finding your information on the internet is always bad. It's that there is a certain thing about, having a publisher and having written a book that has a fancy cover on it and such. Because I've never cracked open one of those books and said, "Oh man, this is fucked up." Like, what? I've never found really bad information in these books, like patently terrible. Maybe in fiction books, but.
But again, I think the point I'm trying to make though is that the point of a publisher is to make money, and so they will publish at least something that they feel that will sell, which means the content has to be sufficiently accessible or valuable to make it worth selling. And you don't have that sense of value with things, because any schlub with a keyboard, as we have seen, and buying a book gives me a greater sense of confidence in what I'm going to read than filtering through 100 blog entries to determine if I think that the writer is credible.
It seems more authoritative, but when you're saying that, the goal of a publisher is to make money, isn't that a dubious motivation? It's not to educate people. It's to publish whatever people will want to read about a topic. I mean,
Right.
I don't
But that's my
disagree with
point.
you. I think there tends to be some pretty good credibility to these books that have been published out there, because I've never been seriously disappointed or felt like, oh my God, this book needs to be like banned or taken off the shelves or something. And it's a little less hit and miss maybe than, following different bloggers, but their motivation isn't to expand community, help people in their personal growth in their play lives and so forth.
Agreed, but the point I'm making is that a lot of these books that we're talking about have been around for a hot minute, and the fact that those books continue to be recommended and have a value implies a value in the book.
I agree. So let's talk a little bit about some fiction. This is where I check out. I don't have a whole lot of fiction under my belt. I don't read a whole lot. I mean,
I read a ton.
even in my non-kinky existence, I generally don't read fiction. I will read some nonfiction. I tell people the only fictional book that I've read lately is the Bible. And that pisses some people off when I say.
Okay, so let's start with sort of, to me, the classic Story of O.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's not very good.
Well, be that as it may, good or not, I mean, that's the nice thing about fiction is it's the girl who wrote it wasn't kinky. Holly
Oh.
Voyage was written by the page, what's the word I'm looking for? I used this word earlier today. I don't remember. A patron who basically knew she could write and said, "I'm kinky. Here are the themes I want you to cover. Go write, and I'll pay you by the page." And so she was basically writing.
How all great literature has sprung, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
You'll pay me to write your fantasy. So
You know,
I agree with Shane in that, this is an iconic story, and some people consider it must-read material, mainly because it speaks to a lot of people, and other people who get their, the seeds of their fantasies from this book.
But
it makes them easier to understand.
It's an important book for a historical and a current pop culture reason that I want to get back to when we start covering some stuff later. There's a connection to some of these things that I think is really important that comes out of that book. Obviously, anything written by the Marquis de Sade, 120 Days of Sodom, any of those books, those are considered classical, kink as opposed to classic. These are some of the original. I mean, we get the word sadism from him, so I think it's fair to say that his writing has had an impact on the community.
Yeah, and I guess, we have to acknowledge, too, that any of these fiction books that are not must-reads, I don't think we're calling anything a must-read, because I don't know that we know, we have the authority to say any of that, but they're not manuals. All fiction, in my opinion, that is, kink related is a stone's throw away from, romance novel. Horrible romance novel. Yeah, and it's awful in that way, but it's kind of great in this way. Just like what Michael said, where it's kind of where you can kind of plant the seeds and build your own fantasies off of it. So don't go home and practice and do exactly that, and certainly don't read it and go, well, now I know how most people think about these things, because that's where there's a huge disconnect. But I think absolutely it's great jumping off material for figuring out how some people think about these things, what you can do with it. So yeah, maybe the writing is not great, but
In a
how
lot of cases,
many
it's not.
fantasies that people have are spawned from those books. I mean,
But here-
you see it everywhere.
What's really interesting, I've been watching a lot of TED Talks lately. One of my favorite TED Talk people is a guy by the name of Rodney Mullen, who's a former skateboarder from the 80s. And one of the things that he talks about is this idea that people are capable of doing things when they are made aware that these things are possible.
Yeah.
And I think that what happens is when people read these, it puts them into a space where they say it's okay to have fantasies. There's this acknowledgement that if I think these things and I can read similar things, that it's okay, I'm not the only one. Because a lot of times people come to this stuff with some of these ideas in their head, and so this idea of fantasy alone resonates with them. Like, there's a lot of stuff in the story of O that I don't do, I would never do, even in terms of kink fantasies. But the fact that there are other people who think equally weird things was comforting.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Just even, I think what Josie is saying is, as long as you're not taking these things seriously, as long as you're not considering these things instructionals.
Manual, yeah.
Right.
Well, as long as you don't expect them to be super quality, super high quality literature, because most of it's not.
But to Josie's analogy, I think the thing that's really important is that these are no more to BDSM than a Harlequin romance is to a real-life relationship.
What are you talking about? Those are
Exactly.
those are instructional, aren't they?
Well, sure, if you plan on dating Fabio, who's on the cover of all of them, then sure.
Yeah, but there's truth in all those things, Maybe your real-life boyfriend is not going to have a wolf for a dog and constantly walk around with his shirt unbuttoned and be a pirate. But he could have a dog. He could wear, his shirt unbuttoned sometimes, and he might be, an investment banker.
Because his beer belly won't fit in it, so he has to unbutton.
There's a seed of, truth in all those things.
So, does anybody want to talk about 50 Shades of Grey? Or are we over that?
I think that's a great kinky book to read, if for no other reason than the chapter on contracts. I think that's kind of fantastic, because where else do you see a book that has actual check boxes and options that are checked and unchecked? How great is that?
I think language, it's funny because people talk about the lack of consent in a lot of the scenes, and I've never read a kinky fiction book that didn't have non-consent in it, and I'm not sure why it gets the lion's share of abuse, but it is the only book that I've read that talks extensively about how do you get consent. Now, it may not be accurately reflected in the book in terms of the way the characters interact with each other, but at least it creates a language that people who are unfamiliar with it can start to use.
Yeah.
I think it's an incredibly important book, and I mean this legitimately, because it has brought kink in a good, bad, indifferent perspective to an audience that had no exposure to it. So I can have a much easier conversation with people now when I say, I'm kinky, and they go, oh, what does that mean? And I can say, oh, have you read 50 Shades? I can say, it's like that. I would never say it is that, but at least it allows me to create a dialogue that wasn't possible. I mean, we're talking about 35 million people who have read this or whatever it is. That's a pretty big wedge into a space that never existed before at that level.
I'm just looking at Amazon's top 100 BDSM erotica as it is right now. The first thing that strikes me is the number one book is called Ex-Con Selected Sinners, and it's a $4 Kindle book. Then after that, all of these are pretty much $1. Some of them are 99 cents, some of them are $1.99, some of them are $2.99. Owning Her Innocence.
Yeah.
Yes. The complete 50 Shades of Alice something. Really? Okay. Under His Sheets. Taking What's Mine. Taking What's Ours, apparently. I'm guessing same author, same theme. Then there's Menage and His Willful Bride, and one called Hung. That's from the Selected Sinners series. And then there's a whole box set of No Shame in Submission. So none of these sound like anything I'd want to get close to or touch with a 10-foot pole, but apparently people are lapping these things up.
Right, and don't doubt that 50 Shades is probably a big, people read that and went, what else is there?
Yeah, and the authors said, this is fucking drivel. I want a piece of that pie. You know, I can write like shit too and crank out a book every 2 months.
But I'll tell you what was really interesting. We were in a Target a couple of months ago, and it was kind of at the tail end of the big 50 Shades push, right? So at the top shelf, and literally running the entire row, if you've ever been in a Target and you have their book section, the entire top 3 rows were the 50 Shades trilogy. So they went in order. The top one was the first, the second row, right?
This was recently?
Oh, a couple of months ago. Like this was a while back.
Yeah, that is recently. I mean, in relation.
But you drop down one level below the 50 Shades, and what shocked me, and this is a nice segue as well, was below 50 Shades were the Sleeping Beauty trilogy. And I went, oh Lord, if you think that that is a smooth transition for your gentle readers of 50 Shades, I expect a lot of refunds from housewives that are not happy about, getting transported, by your anus on a cross. Like that, we are not talking about, and that book is literally, not even that book, that trilogy is based on non-consent. And people in the kink community venerate these books. They love them, right? And that's the disconnect I have, where they're like, oh my God, Christian Grey is just, it's so not consensual. I'm like, yet I go to your house and you've got the Sleeping Beauty trilogy on there, which is literally about grabbing someone by the hair like a caveman, dragging them off to your castle and making them run around naked. Like, where is the consent in that? Right.
I think part of that disconnect, though, is that the 50 Shades trilogy is meant to be in modern times. It doesn't seem like a fantasy book in that it's relatable to modern times.
Sure, but it's
as
still... As
opposed to Sleeping Beauty sounds like you're on another planet, basically, that, that non-consent is okay because it's obviously fiction.
Right, well, let's Michael, and that is absolutely one of the best unintended segues ever. So let's talk about another planet. Let's talk about gore, shall we?
Do we have to? Okay, let's talk about gore.
No, but this is important in the context. People who take fiction seriously and literally apply it, there are people that legitimately in the kink community, and for some reason it's less now, but like I said, a decade ago, there were people who treated gore books like their kinky Bible, and I don't mean that in any kind of hyperbolic way. There were people who were like, well, on page 73, clearly if you're not in this position...
But those aren't regular kinky people. That's a subset of the kink community that takes those books as their Bible.
Right, but that's my point, though, is that...
Be more specific, because if someone's not familiar, they're going to think that everybody does that. It was never a point when everybody did that.
It's a subset, but again, there are people who would talk to you and talk about the fact that it was written by a sociologist, and that's why it's okay.
Sure.
Like, it's this weird, I realize it's fiction, but it's thinly veiled fiction. This is somehow a manual for life, and it's frustrating to me because, like the Bible, I hear a lot of people preaching and not a lot of people living.
All right, I wanted to do a little section here because for a while there, and I haven't had time to do this lately, I was curating articles for the Kink Tank. If you followed us on any of the social media outlets, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, even Tumblr. And if you go to thekinktank.com, you can find links to all of these and our subreddit and a few others. And while I was curating these articles, I found that there are a number of websites out there that pretty consistently churn out quality reading material. And I wanted to shout out to some of those. One of them is a fairly new website, someone who's participated in our discussions before. Aaron Kennedy has sexfortherest.com, and there are some great articles on there to read. But as I was curating these articles, I realized that some of them I reuse over and over. These are, wells that I keep going back to. Great articles. So I would probably start with the Submissive Guide and the Dominant Guide. It's submissiveguide.com and dominantguide.com. And there is a consistency of the material that they're putting out that I think is pretty well-rounded and definitely on point. So those would be good ones to visit. I think fetish.com is a fantastic repository of articles with a wide variety, a wide scope to it. I'm a big fan of the Daily Flogger. I don't know if you guys know the Daily Flogger.
That's not kink literature.
It is. It's totally kink literature. Actually, it's a satirical blog.
Really loosely here.
It's a satirical blog that gives you a couple of cheap yucks every day. that makes fun of the community, and a couple posts a week. I get a nice little smile on my face. There is the BDSM Training Academy, which is bdsmtrainingacademy.com. There's some good stuff on there.
These are all nonfiction. Mostly.
So far, they've been nonfiction. Looking at Cassandra Dane's website, if you're particularly into spanking, or if you like to read sort of more like journal entries that are applicable to everyday BDSM. She has a WordPress website, cassandradane.wordpress.com. Let me see, a bunch of podcasts and stuff. Do you guys have any favorite websites?
Well,
good fiction, nonfiction, comedy?
For kink satire, nothing beats Yes Sir Whatever Sir on Tumblr.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty funny.
Like, and it's funny because it's kind of like the Jon Stewart of kink, where you're like, oh, I know that guy. Like, whatever they're posting, you're like, oh, I know that guy. Like, it's
we all know someone just like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Tumblr version of This Is Spinal Tap.
Okay.
Like, we know it's a joke, but it's not really a joke. You know what I mean? Like, it hits a little close to home sometimes.
Okay.
I think the big one that we've left out so far is there's a Literotica.
Yep. Yeah, that's a big one. To be fair, the Literatica's been around for so long, I think it's easy to forget it.
Right, but it is an excellent resource, and the reason I say that is because it's easy to navigate. Once you get to the page that you want to be on, it's kind of a weird website when you get to it. But you just go to the writing part. Don't go to the porn part unless you mean to go to the porn part. So here's the cool thing about Literotica. They organize all of their stories by genre. So if you want to use it as a tool to learn about, I love this. And when I first started getting involved in community, because kinky people, they shoot themselves in the foot with this whole thing about just being so militant about protecting their anonymity, and they don't like to tell anybody about what they actually do. So visualizing this is really hard. Well, all of these stories, you can go, and there's a section on non-consent, and there's a section on incest or age play or whatever they call it. They change the thing sometimes. There's a section on power exchange. There's a section on
aliens.
Yes, it's all very specific. So if people keep talking about, about having a fetish, about they have like a sadism, masochism as distinguished from BDSM power exchange. If you're not understanding the difference, read a couple of the stories in both categories. You get an immediate picture of what they're talking about. If non-consent does not make any sense to you what they're actually talking about, there's a story about it. If you just can't really understand what people mean when they're talking about age play or incest play, or I think there's even a section on edge play, you can read a story on it. It's already categorized for you. And I think their categorizations are spot on every time. Some stories you'll find in more than one category, but I think it's sexy. Sometimes you can find like a 15-chapter story, and it's totally free.
There's a couple of things that I think are really important about that as well. One, all the stories are tagged, and it has a search feature.
Yes.
So if you find something in a story that you like, again, especially if you're new, you can do a search on power exchange, and it'll bring up everything with those tags. But the other thing is that it lists everything by the author, even if the author is just their online handle. Mm-hmm. So if you find an author that you like, you can track down all of the stories they've written.
Cool.
So I know a lot of people will say, well, I read this 2-page short story that somebody wrote, but when I went to the author, they've got, as Josie said, a 15-chapter, story, that they've written that you can follow along. And they have things like submission, where they have collaborative stories where people add in their own sections to writing. So it's a very unique way of engaging people to participate in this sort of fantasy, for lack of a better term.
They're also rated by users, so a lot of people who log in who are frequent readers, they're marked by stars, or they're marked by like a rating system up to a certain number. So you can see. I don't always find that the most reliable, but
because the problem is that it's not like Amazon where it says 843 people have rated this story. It just gives you a number, and sometimes that number is a 10 because it got one review by the author.
Right.
Yeah, I think another good blog that's it's just a good blog, I think. Neither of these two blogs that I like to read are super, super kink-centric, but kink certainly pops up pretty regularly. So does just relationship dynamics, power exchange, those kinds of things, how to navigate them. So one of them is stories, and one of them is kind of stories, but mostly his own input is theferret.com. I don't know if anybody follows him.
I was going to mention the Ferret.
Yeah,
he's on Fed a lot. I mean, I don't read his website, but I've seen his stuff on Fed a lot.
Oh, his website is the same. It's just cross-posted, but it's just great material. He's got a great voice. He's a great author, but he's just right a lot of the time. And a lot of the topics he talks about are absolutely pertinent to kink community right now, current, and he tends to talk a lot, too, about events, going to events, challenges with going to events, taking different partners to events. So if you're reading it for entertainment or if you're reading it for informational purposes, he's on there. He's great. Do you want to say more about him? I have one other one.
Go ahead.
The other one is, and again, it's a gay sex blog. It's mostly a sex positive blog, but a lot of kink tends to go into it. A lot of talking about, like, not negotiating specifically, but just in how to manage yourself. And these are great stories, but this guy, he does a breeder's journal. It has a lot of kink content in it, and generally speaking, I think just really good writing and sex positive writing. It's an actual story of his encounters. Mm-hmm.
I think Leatherati is a good place for current events if you're interested in community and things that are going on specifically in leather. There is a blogger by the name of, and I'll probably butcher this, but it looks like Zhao Ying Tai, which is abjectsub.com. A lot of great material on there. A few other shout-outs I wanted to do for Stabity, who is at notjustbitchy.com, which is often a satire, or that, as Shane, you were saying, like sort of a, often making fun of ourselves. In that sort of Jon Stewart
the British
way.
would call it taking the piss.
Taking a piss. Yep. Eve Manax. There are a lot of great ones out there that I like to, these are people, Zoe Tershi, that I curated a lot because they provided a lot of quality content on a regular basis. And that's not always easy to do. Sometimes people have like a one-off article or something that's very popular. These are people that continue to be engaged and continue to, post a few things a week. So I think we'll wrap this up on the reading end of things.
And for information, the Leather Journal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good recap type site. They've actually got a hard copy print that they do, but they do everything online as well. And locally, I think it's really important because they publish a lot of stuff related to kink in the media and also things like events. Is Great Lakes Den.
Yes.
Great Lakes. I think it's greatlakesden.net.
Yes.
But
yes,
it's another really good site. They've got a Facebook page as well, so you can keep up with them. But again, a lot of important news stuff and also regional event stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you, panel, for our little section there on BDSM reading. So we're going to take it over now and talk a little bit about BDSM writing. And
go, Josie.
Josie is probably our most prolific writer on the panel. I wanted to talk about writing in a couple of different ways. I mean, obviously, there's writing for fun and writing for, the holy grail of the kinky and popular crown. Then there's also writing and journaling in a relationship, in a BDSM relationship sense. So let's talk a little bit about writing for fun, for just expressing yourself either in short story form or writing little bits of erotica. And Josie, I know that your Fat Life is not just pretty rich in content on its own, but you also interact with a lot of other folks who are sort of really into this writing for fun type of thing. So even following your profile can lead you to a lot of other little nice gems in there.
Oh yeah, I think so. Well, I think that I don't mean to get on this horse too much. It's just I feel really strongly about this version of writing. You know, people who write on FetLife, some of them do write to be published. A number of them are published. They self-publish on Amazon, which anybody can do if they just
For a dollar.
yeah, it doesn't. They don't vet anybody. You just do what you want, and then you pimp yourself out, and you see how many you can sell. But I think a lot of them are really in it to give you this picture of this human experience. And from that, I personally I know that the one most beneficial thing that I have done to educate myself on kink or to get myself to feel more well-rounded and well-grounded in kink has been reading and becoming friends with those people. Because a lot of them are ugly. There are pretty stories and there are ugly stories, and they're stories that you might not have gotten to see if you didn't go to an event, or really even if you just haven't experienced a lot of those things.
And you're not going to find it on the shelf at Barnes & Noble? Is that what you're saying?
No. No, and sometimes because the material is just too edgy, sometimes because the material is ugly and very short. And ugly, I mean it's beautifully written, it's the material isn't it's not a happy story all the time. So I think a lot of the people on FetLife who tend to circle in these crowds. I mean, I don't know. Do you want their names? Is that helpful to people? They tend there's a community of a few people that just tend to be constantly on Kinky and Popular, or they just tend to be well respected in the writing circles of the FetLife universe, as it's different from.
Well, sure, you can shout out some of your favorites. Surely.
Yeah, I can't say that word, but that's what it is. I think that some of the standouts. There's a guy on there called The Wolf. He writes a lot of really interesting stories about kink encounters, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Those kinds of things. I think Girl Named Bill is huge. She's constantly on the big pages there. There's another lady. Her name's Magnolia Red. There are just a number of them. If you follow one, you can usually find the rest because they're all friends with each other. Cat Laughing is a pretty huge one, and then there's one guy named Doc Proteus, and he also has a blog the same as the Ferret does outside, and he does a lot of cross posting. And then what is his name? I think his screen name is Sex Smurf, but he runs a lot of poly and sex positive groups, and I want to say in the Denver area. But he's a great speaker and one of those people who writes somewhat about himself. But mostly just about topics that you just kind of want to raise your hand and say preach to. He just does a really accurate view of things, I think. But the reason they do it, I think, matters. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you the reason that you do it, because you have a number of stories that you've put up there, and some of them are more, diary entries, or, and some of them are obviously fiction. Some of them are a mix. What do you get out of it?
So everything that I publish is, I publish it as erotica, I publish it as fiction. I usually tell, people it's most accurately described as probably creative nonfiction. Parts of it are true, but they're all jumbled up, they're all mixed together, partially because it's personal stuff, and kind of don't want, I'm not the kind of person who likes to put everything out as this is what happened yesterday. But I think that the reason that I probably do it is I don't know that I have a better tool to examine myself with than to write down some of these things that go through my mind and then to read them that day or another day or 3 years after. It's a really interesting way to kind of look at yourself and your own experience. It preserves a lot of things. People forget things, and good, bad, and ugly, you still want to remember. But I think too, sharing a lot of those things, it's exciting, it's sexy, it's interesting, it's a way to put yourself out there too. It's kind of playing with yourself.
Does it qualify in your mind as exhibitionism?
Some of them, sure. Some of them, absolutely. I think some people write for shock value. Some people's stuff happen to find shocking. But putting yourself out there is kind of playing with yourself. It's a challenge. It can be really hard, but it can be really rewarding. Whether someone reads it or not, it doesn't really matter. I think the point is to push the publish button and then just send it out into the universe. When I first started doing it, that was the only point of why I was lucky that I got followers from it. But the point of it was to not keep it to myself. It was just to send it out into the universe and just see what happened.
And you found that to be rewarding because of what feedback that you got, or for what it did for you personally, or is it part of a process of your mind? You know what I mean? Like some people like think to themselves or talk to themselves or work it out with friends. You know, is it a processing tool or is it a venting tool?
I'm sure for other people it's probably a venting tool. I tend to try to stay away from that just because I don't like. I try to stay clear of material that would in some way, you know, be disrespectful to my partners who might be in my stories or things like that. But certainly.
I don't even mean venting in a bad way. I just mean like, you know, just like you said, putting it out into the universe, just making it real somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Make it real. You know, it happened, or you wanted it to happen, or you thought it, and you need someone else to know. Certainly self-expression, those kinds of things. But also, this incredible thing happens when you make the choice to write something in a public way, and that's either on FedLife or on some sort of a blog. Lots of people have blogs. Why do you have blogs? Well, I think that this amazing thing happens when you put something out into the public and people respond to it. When someone, you know, reads it, that's really something. You know, you shared it with someone, but sometimes people comment, and some of the stuff that you get back from people can really shake you up. Some of the most touching things I think that you get are people that comment and say, I know exactly what you're talking about, or I feel the same way, or this is hot, I think about this too. Any of that feedback is just kind of an amazing thing, and maybe you weren't brave enough to say it, you know, with your mouth in front of someone else's face. But this is a way that you can connect to people. It's tremendously connecting to other people. And you're sharing personal shit. You're saying bad words. You're talking about things that you just don't talk about at a dinner table. And it's just really, really liberating. And to know that there are other humans, I think, in the world that can understand what you're saying or who say similar things in a different way is a pretty cool experience.
Right. So, and I know that you value some of these connections you made. You were talking about, you know, connecting with other people is a big part of it. It sounds like there's a bit of validation that goes on too, in the same way, you know, fellowship, like in the same way that I talk about people coming into the kink community. It's just nice to know that other people are as weird or fucked up or dirty or, you know, think about the same things that you do, or that you're not quite alone. Is that part of it?
Oh, sure. There was someone who posted a story the other day about this kind of crazy, edgy version of her version of pet play that she just kind of made up in her mind. She got like 400 likes on it. And it was funny because one of the comments that she put up on it was, oh, hey, I didn't think anybody would like this story. And then it just became this big thing. And I think for stories like that are just tremendously validating because all of us feel like freaks. And I was having this conversation with someone just yesterday. You know, we all think that we're the weirdest toy in the box. We all think that because we're kinky, we're, you know, automatically different than everybody else because, you know, only like 7 people in the world are involved in this kinky, weird behavior. It kind of reminds you that that's not true. You're not the weirdest weirdo. There is always someone weirder than you. And better yet, there are people that have your same version of weird, and you fully articulate it. I mean, and in this way, there's no mincing words. You're using bad words. You're saying bad things. And people are giving it back to you.
And for some people, that's probably intensely validating and affirming and feels good. And I guess for other people, that might be a little disappointing because they think that they're the weirdest tool in the box, and it turns out that they're not. That they're, you know, they're not as special as they thought. Is that do you think writers get that too, or do you think some of the people that you read, you know, like this one that you thought was a sort of a strange take on pet play, do you think that was encouraging that person got that kind of feedback, or was there a little bit like, hey now, like you just took some of my extraordinary, you know, some of the things that make me special or what I thought made me special, and now I'm just like everybody else apparently.
Well, I think if you grasp too tightly to any of those things, you're just setting yourself up for a lot of disappointment. But I think no. I think that it's kind of, I think it's great when you encounter someone who is clearly weirder than you, and clearly has these same version of crazy thoughts in their head, and even better than that, someone who can articulate them better than you. That's like the holy grail. That's like the highest possible reward that you can find, because maybe you didn't have the words for it and they did, or you didn't have the balls to say it out loud and they did, and it's hot, or it's fun, or it's interesting, or it's creepy, or it's scary. It's all of these things. But short of a movie, or short of just being lucky enough to witness a scene that changes your life, this is the closest you can get. And it's easily accessible, and that's pretty cool too, right? That you don't have to go to some seedy, scary club in the middle of nowhere just to try and get one of these experiences. Some people can convey them so well that, you feel like you were there, and I think that's a really, really cool thing. It's safe, it's fun.
Let me get your opinion on this. I thought it was everybody's opinion on this, really. There was that in the movie Quills, which I highly recommend, with Jeffrey Rush and Joaquin Phoenix, Michael Caine, and a whole bunch of others, about the Marquis de Sade. There was a point where he was publishing these dirty books without the knowledge of the heads of this mental institution that he was confined in. And when they found out, he basically went to Joaquin Phoenix's character, who is a priest, goes over and hangs out with the Marquis in his room, and was remarking on the fact that he obviously writes more than he reads, and that's like a sign of an amateur. A writer who doesn't read as much as he writes. Do you think there's something to that? Do you think that good writers read more than they write, or about the same, or doesn't any of that matter? If they're a good writer, they're a good writer.
It's interesting. I'll make a reference to Quills as well, and I think it's interesting because I've heard this from people the same way. I think no matter what your creative outlet is, there are some people who cannot help themselves. Right? There are people who never go to art galleries and do nothing but paint, because that's just what calls to them. That's just what they do. I mean, they wake up in the morning and that's how they manifest their emotions. And I know I've talked to some people who say, I wake up and there are just words that have to come out of me. I mean, that's just how I am. And so it's not about your version of translating an idea based on language that you might have read somewhere else, or being inspired by a style, or some kind of phrasing that you may have read somewhere else. It's just, bah. I have to put this out there, and so I don't know. And some of that writing is really bad. I know some people who call themselves authors because they self-published on Amazon, and I wouldn't line a cat cage with what they write, because it's just, but that's not to say it doesn't have a value to them, right? There are just people who write not for recognition and not for the sake of being highly known, published authors. They just don't know how not to.
Yeah, I think those people too tend to benefit absolutely from reading for a couple of different reasons. One of them being stylistic differences. I think people get this idea that for them to write, especially to write erotica, it has to look like a romance novel. It does not. It absolutely does not. Please don't do that. Don't do that. You can just maybe branch out, because there are so many different ways you can talk about it. There are so many people that have found this really brilliant way of snapshotting, where they're telling you a story, but all they told you about was, in the end, if you had to sum it up, a person reached forward and touched their face. That could be a whole piece of erotica, and it's very long and it's very interesting. But it's a snapshot. So these stylistic differences you can absolutely learn from. I think also your frame of reference, right? What's okay to write about and what's not. Because as a writer, if I can't find anyone who I think is better than me, or anyone who absolutely blows me out of the water with regard to like going there better than I can, like crossing the line better than I can, then I've failed. I've stopped growing. You have to find someone who can do it better than you.
Yeah, that's a sign that you're not reading enough, if you can't find somebody better than you.
Yes, and it should be easy for you to find someone who's better than you. They're everywhere, especially on a platform like what we're talking about on FetLife, where, I'm sure, I don't think there there's a tab where you can look at writings, and there's a new one published. This is a worldwide, database, so there's one published every 5 seconds. Just keep refreshing it. There's this huge body of material, but I think absolutely it makes you a better writer, but it also kind of gives you permission to write more and to write better yourself. Because if you're writing this story and you're like, oh, it's so dirty, I just talked about it, and I talked about this thing that happened yesterday, and it's just, I can't believe I just did that. And then you scroll through and you find one of these people who's brilliant or who just wrote about something that makes you go, oh, really? The next time you write, maybe you're more daring. Maybe you share a little more. Maybe you push a little further. And I think it makes you grow as a writer, but to be honest, I think it makes you grow as an individual, because what you write, for some people, stays in your writing. Maybe all they do is sit at their computer and they do writing. The people that I enjoy reading and the people that I hope enjoy reading me, like that those people are doing a lot of the things that they're writing about, and they're trying things out, and their writing tends to grow and change as they experience new partners or experience different kinds of play, and I think it just makes you a more well-rounded individual, not just a more well-rounded writer.
Okay. Let's shift. Go
quickly,
ahead, Shane.
I just really want to quickly throw in a shout-out because it twigged my brain, and it's because she hasn't written in a long time. But when you talk about the snapshot thing, Josie, one of my favorite writers that used to write on Fed a lot more is Fev.
Oh, genius. She's my favorite.
She used to write some really, really sketchy, like when you talk about dark stuff, she used to write some really dark stuff, and it wasn't particularly long, but it was always like, ugh, like it gave you this kind of feeling like I feel dirty for having read it, but I want to read more.
It's beautiful, it's genius, it's inspiring, she's incredible. All her stuff is still up. You can go through the archives. Yeah.
But she doesn't publish anything new, which is disappointing.
She's supposed to be publishing a real book.
I've heard rumors.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, shifting gears a bit, and let's talk a little bit about not writing for fun or writing for expression, but writing for communication and writing for a task or a chore. Has anybody been in a relationship that required some kind of writing, a daily journal? I know that some people communicate better that way in their relationships when they're writing it down. So instead of sitting down talking face to face, they get it in an email, or they get it in a blog or a journal entry or a piece of paper stuck on their bed or something. Has anybody been involved in a relationship that explicitly required some kind of writing?
I have. I've actually been on both sides of that. When I first started out in the community, it wasn't even the community. When I first started out on FetLife, I guess, I got into a long-distance relationship with a guy up in Indianapolis, and he asked me to write daily journals, which didn't last very long because I found that I expected a response, and at least once in a while, and I just kind of got dead silence, and it didn't really work out for me because I think I'm a conversationalist by nature. It's hard for me to just put my thoughts out there and then not discuss them later. And then when I was in another type of relationship, I had a submissive who I required to write to me because he and I started out, we actually met on FetLife, and we played an online role-playing game together. And I found him to be a different person online than he was in person. Mm-hmm. So his communication skills in person were much worse, in my opinion, than they were online. So I asked him to keep a Google Drive document that I could check at any time, and sometimes I would watch him as he wrote it, which I thought was really interesting. But I found that became problematic after a while because he would use it to passive-aggressively talk to me rather than just coming and talking to me even though we were in the same house at one point.
There's always that risk.
Yes, I think that's probably a pretty big risk with journaling.
I think some people like it because of the things that will get said that wouldn't necessarily be said face-to-face, but that's a double-edged sword as well. So I'm with you though. If it's something that I'm trying to think back if I've ever made something like that mandatory. I don't do a whole lot of reading, so kind of like you, you wanted you were fine with writing as long as somebody was reading it. And if I'm
Right.
not going to read it, on some kind of regular basis, bring it up, discuss it, reply to it, something like that, I feel like it's probably not a very fruitful endeavor for a power exchange relationship. Does anybody feel differently? I mean, I imagine that there are some people out there who write, as an expression that helps them as a processing tool for themselves, and it's just going out to the universe. It doesn't necessarily need to be read by anybody, but it needed to be said, or it's a way that helps them, adjust or I don't know, process, get through things, define their opinions or the way that they feel about some things, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be read or validated in that way.
So I know we'll go back to the required reading. We have an agreement that if I am out of town or if he is out of town away from me, that I have to write kind of a daily recap of what happened, because a lot of times when you're at that distance, where someone is in another state or whatever, it's hard to, over text message, 2, 3, 4 times a day, really convey kind of everything that happened, and it kind of gives you a time at the end of the night to kind of go back through, oh yeah, and this happened, and oh yeah, and this happened too, and stuff, so it allows you at least a time to provide more specific details or more kind of what happened or things that went on, and he'll every once in a while, kind of respond to those next time that we're together. And so that was an expectation that's been set for a while.
Is that helpful?
I think for him just to be able to kind of have those details, he can speak to that.
Well, the reason I did it is because, obviously people here on the panel, some people know me better than others, but I'm a real information junkie. One of the issues is that I kind of want to know what's going on all the time, and it's interesting because I want to know, like, people can be personal journalists. I woke up, I ate toast, something happened to me at work, and I can get all of that information. But what I really want to know is I like to track, at least in my own head, people's emotional ebbs and flows. And you can get that when people write. You can get a sense of how people are feeling on any particular day. And so I like to know how people are doing. So for me, and everything I think has to come out of a function. When Gypsy tells this story, it's because I was in an area that didn't get cellular service, so we couldn't text that way. Mm-hmm. And so what would happen is I would have her write, and then we would do things like go into town where I could get Wi-Fi and then pick up the messages kind of like once a day. And so it was easier for me to recap it. But I liked what I was getting from that, so whenever we're apart, whenever we're essentially out of state from each other, whether I'm traveling or she's traveling, it's still a requirement. But what's really interesting about that is, to Christina's point, I do respond. Like, I do read it intensely, and I parse it. I look for things. I read between the lines. It's important for me to understand what's being said, and so it invariably always leads to a discussion after the fact. And they might be short, right? There might be nothing really hidden in there, but I might spot a feeling that comes out that I want to delve into further. But where it becomes really challenging, actually, is in the not writing part. And this is one of the things that Gypsy, I'm sure, will speak to, which is, do people get something out of just writing for the sake of their own processing of things? And that's more how Gypsy goes through things. And I am absolutely a right here, right now. If you're feeling something, I want to hear it. If I'm feeling something, I'm going to tell you. And so her writing things, I think, is good for her because I will pound the shit out of her wanting information now that she may not have the vocabulary to express. And so writing allows her to develop, to delve into those emotions, but also to develop a language for expressing it. And so writing provides that tool, not even necessarily just for the sole purpose of processing it, but also understanding that she's going to have to explain this at some point, and so this allows you to develop language. I mean, writing it down, you have to think about words and connecting words to feelings, and is that quite the right word, and is that how I'm feeling? And so that's a good process for her, because I think that she would be inundated if she sort of had to deliver emotional content in the way that I like to have it delivered. It's kind of a compromise.
It
What's
gives
that?
you space to do that, too. I mean, how many times do you have a heated relationship conversation with your person, whoever your person is, and you walk away, and 3 seconds later you go, oh, shit, you know what? I wanted to say this, and I wanted to say this, and I wanted to mention this, and you don't, because it's hard to use your words.
That's exactly, that you raise an interesting point, because Gypsy's nodding her head going, yeah, that's me, and I'm sitting here going, never.
Sometimes you need that space and that kind of quiet time to really process that. I know that, you know, if I've got something that I'm really chewing on, that I just can't seem to have a conversation about, those are the times that I've written a letter. It's just said, we can talk about this later, but I just need to put this in front of you now, and that's where we can start, because at least then I have something to go off of. It can give you a really nice tool for that, for people that struggle with kind of articulating what they're really thinking or feeling about something that's important or not important.
May I add something to this process, though, because it is definitely different. Like I said, how I process things and how I want information delivered to me, I understand is different. I'm not going to say it's unique, but certainly it's how I see the world. And one of the things that I have an issue with sometimes with writing is that it is processed. And when I can get on somebody about a feeling, an emotion, it admittedly doesn't always work out in my favor, but I always feel like I am better at understanding raw, instinctive emotion than processed emotion.
Right,
You know
but
what I mean?
that only works on certain kinds of people, because if you came at someone like me with that kind of, what are you thinking, what are you doing, tell me everything right now, just let it go raw,
That's about right.
I would close my mouth and not say anything. And I think because you just kind of clam up, you don't have any words to say because you're so aggressive about what you want. And so from someone like me, you're going to get a lot more material if you give me the time to sit down and process.
Or you're afraid of saying the wrong thing. That's
yeah, or what I want to say is too mean and I can't say it to your face, or it's too, it's too something and I just can't stomach saying it, which is bullshit and it needs to be said, but maybe writing it is a way around that.
But that's how that's the funny thing. That's how I want to hear it. But that's me.
Yeah, that is you. I don't always want to hear that.
That's what you want to hear, but that person may not want to say, so you're just going to get a silent partner. From some people. Maybe most people.
To be
He
fair,
has ways of making her talk.
Maybe.
But the interesting thing, though, is, and again, I don't want to get off course, so I'm going to bring it back to the point. It's one of the reasons that Gypsy finds writing practical, because what happens sometimes is there are these gaps in time, right, where I might be gone or she might be at work and she's feeling something, and so that gives her time to think. Even if she doesn't physically write it down, she can develop a script for how she wants to express something, so that when she does see me and she knows I'm going to ask her about something, she's better prepared for that. So there's a process to that of processing through the emotions and creating verbiage for that helps her communicate in a way. It's sort of the compromise between my give me everything now and her being prepared for the onslaught that is me and my essentially demand for information. Like I admit that it doesn't always go well because I can be fairly aggressive in my pursuit of information. And so we've actually worked out literally language that says, working on it, we can talk later. And that's when she's coming up with that, because I would literally just stand over her shoulder saying, tell me what's going on right now. And what happens is if you are upset, you're more upset by the time that information comes out.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we're talking, too, about, like, big, long journal entries. You were talking about giving stuff like assignments. You know, and that's one way to do it. I don't know if I really said it before. I am a notoriously bad journaler, actually. I nothing that I write is a journal. I don't like journaling. I'm so bad at it. It's like doing laundry to me. I hate doing it. It feels like a chore. So anything that I'm writing, I'm taking a feeling that I'm having, and in that sense, maybe it's like a journal, but I'm using that to make something else that in my mind is art or storytelling or whatever that is. But if someone gave it to me as an assignment, I wouldn't respond well to that. And I think I've had that in relationships where they thought that would be a good idea because writing is something that I enjoy. And it just kills my literary boner, like, immediately. I can't get anything
Well,
going.
what if they said, you know, I want you to write me something that isn't a journal entry. I want you to write me a hot story.
Yeah,
That's
right.
your assignment.
I have
Then you
tried
can just
that, too.
conjure those up left and right. You just
Same thing. Here's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
Creatively speaking, and I've talked to people about this, it's the same thing. People always talk to me about how lucky you must be that you've turned your hobby into a job, but they don't understand that once it's a job, there are expectations there that don't exist when you are doing it on your own. So when you decide that you're going to write down, even if you write 5 stories a day, that is the creative outlet. That is the schedule that your creativity has set for you. You might write 5 stories a day and be asked to write 1 a month, and you just go, well, fuck, like, I have no idea what to say. Let me write my other 5 stories and give this one some thought later.
Yeah, and
like,
I would love that. I would love for someone to be able to tell me, you know, write me a story, and for that to be my gift to them. Because, of course, you know, if you're a really good baker, of course you're going to make them a cake. Shouldn't it be the same thing? And I have found, and a lot of people that I know that enjoy writing, you just can't do it. It's never as good a story as you want it to be, and that sucks. I have written stories for people, and then after the fact said, this is about you, or, you know, I've been lucky enough to be able to say, this is for you. I wrote this for you, and I've, you know, made it all pretty, and I've given it to them later, but that's much later after the fact, and they weren't expecting it. But what I will say about that is, you know, another way, I've never been expected to journal, I've never been expected to write, but something that I kind of like to do is if I've had a scene with someone that was particularly special to me or good to me or something like that, or even if I had a really good date or a really good experience or a really good day with somebody, I really like to drop them a little something. And maybe that's a text. It's not really an email anymore. I think I've kind of gone, I've gotten...
Yeah, get with the times.
Technologically. I know. I have a smartphone.
it's a tweet.
It's a tumble.
No, I need more than 150 characters. But I like to tell them, you know, I was feeling this way, and you made me feel this way, and I like to express gratitude. And I think that my partners have never expected that. And what I usually get back from it is like an emoticon, because I think I kind of freak them out with my sincerity, or because they're just so flattered, or because they disagreed. Whatever the reason is, nobody chime in. I think it's a nice thing for my partners to hear that coming from me. I think it is kind of a check-in, kind of like what you guys are talking about, in a less formal way. And maybe we will talk about it, but we probably won't. And I think it still has a lot of value. And if it were an assignment, I think it would still have a lot of value. So I would kind of recommend that.
It would just be harder to do if it were an assignment.
So I actually...
Right, but that's different.
If they were like, I want a recap of our time together in your journal.
If they said I wanted to
man,
check,
fuck this shit.
that's like a text. That's a different
Okay.
thing.
Yeah, but I'm actually the type that actually would prefer the more journally kind of give me like a writing prompt.
Yeah, like
well, I can't do the, you know, erotica kind of make up a story thing. I've tried it a couple times and stuff like that. It just never ended up terribly well. And stuff like that. But I've actually done some stuff like with submissive journal prompts and things like that, which is from the Submissive Guide site. And, you know, just kind of gone through those and found ones that I thought I could add value to by saying something about. And stuff, and so some of them may be just like, you know, well, how do you feel about X, Y, or Z? And just being able to kind of express my thoughts, opinions, you know, my experience, whatever it is, and kind of add to that. And I do have my own WordPress blog thing that I keep now, but for years and years and years back in the, you know, late 90s when it was cool, I had a LiveJournal account that I almost would post on almost weekly.
Oh, LiveJournal.
And it's really entertaining for me now to go back and look through that because it was during the time when I had my son and all of the, changes in my life that I was having because of that, and being able to look back now, 12 years later, and see kind of how I developed and grew through that. I kind of do the same thing with, since I've been in the kink community on FetLife a few times, I've put up a year in review, or things that I learned kind of this year thing. But then maybe in 10 years or whatever, I'll look back at those and kind of see where I was then versus where I am now versus where I think I was then, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's just a way to present things the way they were and the way that I saw them, and then it also may share an experience with something that someone else had. Okay, I'm not the only person that felt this way, or I'm not the only person that had this struggle or that had this thought and stuff like that. And so it's a ability for me to be able to kind of show the generation coming up after me and stuff like that. We've all been there. We all started walking into our first munch not knowing anybody.
Yeah, and a perspective for growth. It's kind of like works a little bit like a photo album, when you go back and look at those, like Facebook pokes you every now and then and says, 3 years ago today, you posted this picture, and you're like, oh my God, what?
That's what I like to use writing for mostly, and stuff like that, is not necessarily the self-expression of a kink or a fantasy or a kind of writing of an erotica and stuff like that, but more of the, this is where I was, and this is, where I'm hoping to be, and this is what I did, and stuff. Like right now, I'm keeping a lot of monthly recaps of kind of where I go, who I meet, what I do, and stuff like that, and just so I can look back and go, yeah, I went to, IMSL, and this is some stuff that happened at IMSL that I wrote about, or I went to IML, and this is some stuff that happened while I was there, and stuff. And so, I'm using them as, like you said, kind of like the photo album. Like I'm keeping these little snippets of this is what happened in my life,
Yeah, and you remember that day, and you remember, oh yeah, and this is how I felt, and this is what we did, and it's a well, and not just that, but to get perspective on yourself now, like look how far I've come.
But it's interesting because I used to keep journals like that, and like Gypsy, it's one of those things that oddly you seem to randomly find again, like you kind of tail off and you stop doing it, and then like 2 years later, you're like, holy crap, I forgot, like this, shows up in your bookmarks or whatever when you're cleaning out your browser history or something. You're like, oh, holy shit, like, what is this? And I go and look, and what amazes me is stuff that I wrote about that I was so passionate about, or that was causing me such emotion that I would write these missives. I'm like, what was that about again? Do you know what I mean? Like,
why did I give so much of a shit? Why?
Oh, no, not even. But like, I'm talking about this thing, this very important thing, and here's how I felt about the thing, and the thing was clearly like soul crushing or uplifting, and I'm going, what was the thing again? Like, what was so important that I wrote all? Because I don't. Was this about somebody? Was this like it might have been about my cat or someone I know. Like I don't remember. And that's the thing I find interesting is that the focus of the detail sometimes, like I've perfectly described a tree that I couldn't find in the forest again if I went looking for it.
Well, we're talking a lot about perspective on a lot of these things. So this whole idea of journaling, it wouldn't work for me as an assignment. But that's just me. I think it's an excellent tool to use in power exchange relationships and within kink-based relationships, if for no other reason than as a check-in, but at best as this kind of way to learn and to grow and to communicate better. But I would really, encourage anybody, kinky or not, but I think it helps if you talk about a lot of the stuff that you're going through, because when you get involved in the kink community, your world gets a little bit flipped upside down and everything expands, and it's a lot all at once, and anyone who tells you that it's not is a liar. But this idea of keeping a journal for yourself, I think I absolutely believe in. For every one story that I post, there are 5 that I don't, and I keep them to myself, and I put them in a blog that only I can see. But what I have there is an archive of myself, and what I was excited by, 3 years ago, or what broke my heart, or this kind of evolution of a relationship, or whatever it is. You can learn from it, and whether you think you're a good writer or not doesn't matter. If you're the one writing it, then you're the one who knows at least how to read it. It doesn't matter what your skill level is. I just think it's a really tremendous tool to look at yourself and to see your growth and to remember things that you might not have, because maybe you'll learn from it, but also maybe it's hot and you just want to have it for later when you need some material. Either way, you know.
Well, that's a good note to end on. We're gonna wrap it up right there.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Cool.
Thank you, panel, for our little talk on BDSM writing. We'll be back in 2 weeks and have a different set of topics. And thank you for the viewers who tuned in. We will catch you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks.
Bye.